Well, hello to everyone. TRT World Forum is continuing to debate what happened in Srebrenica 25 years ago. We are looking at the horrible events, its results, reasons, and also the role of different institutions and actors. Today, our guest is Toby Cadman. He is the co-founder and head of Guernica 37 International Justice Chambers. We are very pleased to have you here, Toby Cadman, and you are one of the well-known experts on the legal aspects. Let me share your short bio with our audience. Toby Cadman is an international law specialist in the field of war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. He is an international human rights lawyer, and he is expert in terrorism, anti-corruption, business and human rights issues. And he also looks at arbitration, extradition, and mutual legal assistance. And also he is very active in civil societies. Toby, we are going to look at the role of the UN and its responsibility to protect civilians. Mm-hmm. Of course, we will begin with a general question, and then we will focus on Srebrenica, because Srebrenica was supposed to be protected by the members of the UN. There was a Dutch Battalion there, and their responsibility was to protect the civilians. UN was established right after the Second World War. It was a part of the international, I think, system, and the mandate gives it a responsibility to prevent conflicts, to prevent wars, and also to establish peace, stability, etc. And there was a lot of hope, actually, when the UN was established as a mechanism. Today, we have got hundreds of UN member states, but there are also increasing number of conflicts all around the world, including the Middle East, Africa, and also in Asia. From this perspective, how do you assess the general success or the failure of the United Nations in preventing conflicts all around the world and in protecting civilians? This is a general question, then we can go on to more specific issues.
I think it's a very difficult situation that the United Nations is faced with, and certainly more recently with the number of peacekeeping missions that are required around the world because of the conflicts that we have seen. I think there is also a certain sense of the inability or ineffectiveness of the United Nations, not just in peacekeeping, but in the general role that the United Nations plays in the field of preventing conflict or stopping conflict or dealing with the aftermath of conflict. So I think that there is that general sense. I think it's also important to look at it from the perspective of victims of civil society that have been directly affected by conflict, and whether they consider the United Nations to have played an effective role. I think that the general response would be that the UN has become increasingly ineffective in this field. I can say that from a professional level. I can also say it from a personal level. I mean, my wife is Bosnian. She lived during the conflict. She lived in the siege of Sarajevo. And I've heard stories from my wife's family about the effectiveness of the blue helmets. I mean, it's no coincidence that they're referred to almost comically as Smurfs from the cartoon character, and that is a very derogatory term because of what they were able to do or to prevent. I mean, even if we look at a year before the tragic events of Srebrenica, we look at what happened in Rwanda, and I think all of us have seen the horrors of Rwanda, what happened at the famous hotel, the Milford Hotel. So, and it was more the efforts of one or a handful of men that prevented further atrocities from being done, rather than the United Nations as an institution protecting. But I think what I would say is one of the biggest concerns, which is often referred to as the Mogadishu factors, which is that states are not prepared to risk a single life of their own forces, and that is what makes intervention very difficult. The final point I'd make on the very general question that's being made, and it's an increasing concern that we've seen in the last few years, and particularly with the number of allegations of sexual assault, gender-based violence that has been encouraged or facilitated by UN peacekeeping and other international missions, and that is a very serious problem. When you look at countries that are contributing to the peacekeeping missions that are going into very dangerous areas, so they're coming from countries like, and I will give an example, Bangladesh, which has an appalling record of its own for human rights, that these individuals are being sent to effectively administer peacekeeping and justice in foreign conflicts. That is obviously deeply, deeply problematic.
I think you have started very, eloquently in order to take it further. Maybe we can look at the UN, especially structure in terms of which countries are more effective, because there is an increasing, as you have said, questions about the effectiveness of the UN. Not only UN, actually, the other international organizations as well. As I said, they were established with the hope that they can bring some kind of stability in the world, but the conflicts are increasing, and I think this is partly because of the UN Security Council, because the UN Security Council cannot take decisions easily. Sometimes this council becomes a area for contestation for different countries. Do you think that plays a role, the formation of the UN Security Council by only very limited number of countries?
Absolutely. I think that one of the biggest concerns that we face now is the politicization and the impotence of the UN Security Council. What we've seen just in the last few days. So we have now a UN Commission of Inquiry report on the attacks on hospitals, in particular in Idlib, being brought out by the Commission of Inquiry on Syria. And then you have Russia and China vetoing a resolution for the provision of humanitarian aid to that area, where more than 1 million people have been made homeless. It demonstrates that we have learned absolutely nothing from Rwanda in '94 and Srebrenica and Bosnia generally from '92 to '95. It means that we've learned very, very little about how to run peacekeeping operations. But I think more problematically, what we have now is that states who are actively engaged in conflict have the ability to prevent any form of accountability. So using the example of Russia as far as Syria is concerned, and to a lesser extent, as far as Yemen and other conflicts are concerned, you have China as far as Myanmar and the Rohingya are concerned, and you also have China protecting itself from attempts, as we see now, for justice for the Uyghurs. So, and I'm not saying that the other powerful members of the Permanent Five are not equally responsible. I mean, we see France shielding Haftar. We see the United States, to some extent, preventing accountability mechanisms as far as Palestine is concerned, and actually even preventing a resolution as far as Syria is concerned, insofar as it concerns the Golan Heights. So, I don't think we can throw mud entirely at Russia and China and no one else. I think all of those states have a responsibility. But what we do see, interestingly, is smaller states like Liechtenstein in particular becoming very important in the role of justice and accountability as far as international justice is concerned. So, but it is, the United Nations was created due to the ineffectiveness of the League of Nations, and we're now at a stage where we now have to have a long, hard look at the effectiveness of the United Nations itself, because its record is really not good. Now, you can't refer to the United Nations as a single institution, of course. There are agencies within the UN that play an incredibly important role, but I think it is the level of bureaucracy that prevents them from effectively carrying out their mandate properly. The inability of executive power to take certain actions. And the peacekeeping is, I think, right up there, that because there is this do not engage, do not put your own troops at risk, regardless of the consequences, that has a serious impact on peacekeeping to have an appropriate response. And I can see you want to interrupt me, but let me just say this final point. When I was actually looking at this before this interview, and I came across a statement by the UN Special Representative for Bosnia, Yasushi Akashi, and I was astounded by what he said, because I wanted, and I wrote it down so that I wouldn't get it wrong. And he said, "The man you bombed today is the man whose cooperation you may require tomorrow for the passage of a humanitarian convoy." Now, if that's the basis upon which we determine peacekeeping missions for the protection of civilians, because we're worried about, if we upset General Mladic today, we're not going to be able to have a humanitarian corridor tomorrow. That is truly worrying.
But I think you made a very important point, and also you touched upon the bureaucracy within the United Nations system. Yes, there might be some sub-institutions in the United Nations system. They might be more effective than the others. But when we look at the overall picture, I think it was not very promising. It was bleak. And I think what we have said is maybe a telling story regarding the fall of multilateralism as well, because United Nations was based on the understanding of multilateralism. All countries from different regions and from maybe different ideological perspectives, they were under the same umbrella, and they were trying to do something. But now what we see is that all countries are pulling everything to their own objectives and ends. So this is something that maybe non-state actors are also becoming more and more influential in the world. Here, as you said, the bureaucracy is an impediment in the UN system. Maybe we can come back to the Srebrenica issue here, because when the war was going on in former Yugoslavia, when the war crimes and atrocities were taking place, there was a frequent call on the United Nations and on the Security Council to issue some statement or to make a decision that the civilians should be protected by Air Force. But that never came out. What is the reason behind it? Why do you think that United Nations did not request the use of air power in defense of civilians in former Yugoslavia, in Srebrenica especially?
I think if I knew the answer to that, then I would probably have the answer to how to fix the United Nations. Unfortunately, I don't think it's a simple, straightforward answer that can be given to the question. I think it is a stain on the reputation of the United Nations that will forever haunt it, that they did nothing when they should have done. There were many reasons for that. There were diplomacy going on behind the scenes. There was the designation of a safe zone, which was obviously what led to the catastrophe 2 years later. You also had investigations going on by that point that had started from the International Criminal Tribunal. So even at that time, there were investigations going on. But there were Dutch troops in Srebrenica and Jepa area, and the United Nations obviously was concerned about bombing its own troops. And I think that's one of the arguments that has frequently been raised as a reason for doing it. But of course, the deployment of peacekeeping and the use of force are two very different things and require very different powers to be exercised at the level of the United Nations Security Council. So the fact that there had been almost like this voluntary deployment of Dutch peacekeeping forces to the area to actually get approval for the use of force was going to be a huge challenge. And look, let's not kid ourselves that Russia, even at that point, was providing a huge amount of support and diplomatic cover for Serbia. So there was already that in the mix that had to be taken into account. But yes, there were lots of reasons. It was difficult to justify, as we saw later on with Kosovo and the bombing of Belgrade. I mean, what effectively brought matters to an end. There was a lot of criticism that the responsibility to protect did not allow for the use of force in such a way, the use of military force. And still there are those that would argue that the use of military force that was eventually used was in breach of international law. So there are those that still do not consider that responsibility to protect allows for, because humanitarian intervention is one thing, use of military force is something else. So there are those considerations that we can say they got it wrong.
In this context, in the context of Srebrenica in former Yugoslavia, how then the authorities in the UN justified their position, just watching what's happening on the ground? You know, people were forced to flee, people were raped, as you have pointed out, and then thousands of people were killed. And I think that, as you have said, you know, we did not learn any lesson from the Srebrenica experience. Today, as you have just pointed out, in Syria, in Yemen, in many other places, the conflicts are going on, and you know, thousands of people were being killed, and the UN is still silent. Maybe there are statements that are coming from the UN, but because the composition of the UN Security Council, so we do not see any improvement or much improvement. I mean, as you said, the civilians are supposed to be protected by the UN, but it was not protected, and it is not being protected at the moment. Then how the UN is justifying this policy?
Well, I don't think they provide any logical basis for maintaining such a policy. They maintain some of the arguments that we've already raised that are not particularly effective. Of course, that one of the biggest difficulties is things are done by consensus. If it's in the Security Council, then there is a right of veto, which, in my view, has to be changed. We have to recognize that things have progressed, conflicts are different. There is not the cooperation of the 5 permanent members that we once had, if we ever did. So it has to be clearly rethought. No, we haven't learned anything. And it's not just from 95 onwards. I mean, we hadn't learned anything from 1994 to 1995. You know, we've got close to 1 million people that were killed in a brutal genocide of the Tutsi. We did not learn anything from that leading up to July 1995. From 1995, we haven't learned anything from that leading up to what happened in Kosovo. Then from that to the conflicts that we've experienced more recently. If anything, the situation has got demonstrably worse because there is this entrenchment of impunity and lack of accountability. I mean, we are at a stage, and I think we should not kid ourselves at how grave a situation we now find ourselves in, where a government such as the United States can effectively bring down unilateral sanctions, which constitutes interference with the administration of justice, which in most countries constitutes a crime, that the United States can do that to prevent investigations that are ongoing as far as Afghanistan is concerned, and potentially as far as Palestine is concerned. So that's how far we've gone, is that we have completely forgotten that to bring an end to conflict, to bring an end to instability, and to create what we would hope would be the foundations of democratic principles based on the rule of law, justice and accountability plays a central role in that. And we do not have that level of truth, justice, and accountability. The International Criminal Court is as impotent as the United Nations in many respects. And so there isn't anymore, this body. I was asked just the other day, not to sort of go off track, but when the former president, the only democratically elected president of Egypt, died in a courtroom, his family are asking me as their lawyer, where can we take this? Let's take it to the International Criminal Court. And I have to say, sorry, you can't. There's nothing you can do. 2,000 people were arguably killed in demonstrations in Egypt. There's nothing that you can do about that because there's no jurisdiction at the International Criminal Court. And unfortunately, Egypt is a partner to the West in the fight against terrorism. So you have this situation where we have not learned anything from what happened in Srebrenica. We haven't learned anything that happened in those conflicts. And our understanding and our thirst for justice and accountability, whilst it may remain strong with us, it doesn't remain strong with those that make decisions.
Well, you have rightly underlined the, I think, incompetence of different organizational setups or actors in the international fora. Recently, there has been, I think, increasing calls for the reform of the UN or other institutions. And Erdogan, the leader of Turkey, is one of them. He is always criticizing the UN and arguing that there should be more inclusive, I think, representation, especially in the Security Council. So what is your view of these calls for reform of the UN to have more inclusive decision-making, let's say, processes and to be more responsive to the world, which are forgotten by the developed countries?
I think that's right. I think the calls for greater equality throughout the UN decision-making process and greater inclusivity is very, very important. And it's important for us to understand and to have a sense that it's not just the powerful Western states that are making decisions for the rest of the world. I think it is important. I think what needs to be done again, as we saw at the time of the Second World War, is that there has to be a long, hard look at what the UN stands for, what it is there to achieve. I mean, I think it almost certainly has lost sight of what its primary objective is, or the bureaucracy that's been created makes it impossible for it to actually undertake those tasks that it's set up to do. And so that does require a fundamental reform. If you look at the UN Human Rights Council, for example, which has been hugely criticized, you have states like Saudi Arabia sitting on committees for human rights and fundamental freedoms. You have countries like Saudi Arabia and the UAE sitting on panels to decide women's rights, which is about as ludicrous as one could imagine. You have countries like Venezuela on human rights committees. So you have to take into account, whilst inclusivity is important, there also has to be a basis upon which the body can actually take a decision, and take a decision with some credibility. And I think that's one of the difficult challenges to bring, is that it has to be able to make those decisions with credibility. I think some of the states that are calling for reform, I think is right. They should be calling for reform. But I think the reform also has to start from within. I think states need to also get their own house in order before they start calling on the global order to reform itself. Not a criticism of Turkey, but for example, when we look at international justice and accountability, countries like Turkey and Qatar who are calling for reform, I would say they need to also look at themselves and ratify the Rome Statute, join the International Criminal Court. Steps need to be taken like that from within in order to address the wider problems from without.
You argue that I think reforms should start with the nation states, within the nation states themselves. Then it should go on to more, let's say, global level. But given your vast experience in the international legal arena and also in U.S. system, do you have any hopes of reforms. I mean, do you think these calls will be realized, or these are going to be only rhetorical or discursive calls?
I think we live in the age of misinformation and propaganda. Unfortunately, I think that's what our generation will be defined as, is that decisions are made. There are no truths anymore. There are different spins on what the person who's speaking interprets to be a truth. And so, do I think that reforms are likely? No, I don't. Realistically, honestly, no, I don't. It shames me to say that, and that doesn't mean that we should stop fighting for it. Of course, we should continue to fight, and we should continue to expose injustice wherever we see it. But I think we also have to be realistic as to what is going to happen. We will always get states using misinformation, disinformation, and propaganda to effectively undermine a process which is aimed towards a better future, because it's not in their interests. Many of them, it's not in their interest for that to happen. So they will do whatever they can to undermine it, and it's almost like they're shooting the messenger rather than addressing the message.
Toby, we have been concentrating on the Srebrenica after 25 years in the TRT World Forum this week. And I would like to come back to the Srebrenica issue after this general assessment of the UN and whether the reform calls will be realistic or not. You have some personal connection to the area as well, I mean, through your family connections. I'm sure that you have followed the events, and then you have read a lot of it, and also you have heard about the experience of people. Here, there has been a lot of discussion on the role of the UN peace, let's say, force there, especially the Dutch Battalion, because thousands of people, I think, invested their hopes in the UN protection army, I would say, or the military force in Srebrenica, but they did nothing. And how that could have happened? I mean, still, I mean, people are not able to grasp the reasons behind it. There was a unit by the UN, and they had the authority, they had the mandate, but somehow thousands of people were massacred, and a genocide took place just before the eyes of the UN.
Well, I think I would put it in this way. If I'm out for a walk later today and I'm standing next to a pond and I see a child drowning and I do absolutely nothing, because I'm actually worried I might get wet, I might even drown myself. So I'm not going to save that child. What would the response be to that kind of action? And I think it's comparable to what we saw. What I find particularly shameful is that when this matter came before the Dutch courts as to the Dutch government's responsibility, they came up with this shameful decision that the Dutch Battalion were only 10% responsible because these people would have died anyway. That, I think, demonstrates the gravity of the problem, is that there is this lack of taking responsibility. Why did they not engage? Why did they allow this to happen? How did they allow this to happen? There have been numerous inquiries into what could have been done and what should have been done, but it wasn't. And in those circumstances, you have to put your hands up and say, we are deeply, deeply sorry for what happened. We should have done better. We failed you and we didn't. But they didn't do that, and they still haven't done that. And to the mothers of Srebrenica. So I spent from 2002 to 2010 living in Bosnia, and for a large part of that, I was based at the prosecutor's office in Bosnia, and for one part of that, assigned to dealing with Srebrenica. And so I had to travel to Srebrenica once a month to meet potential victims and talk to them about that. And I'd met with the mothers of Srebrenica and also victims groups from around the country. And I think that is the common theme, is that they were just forgotten about. And so it's difficult for me to sort of sit here and say what should have been done. I think to the mothers and to all of the victims who lost family members in the Bosnian War, but particularly in Srebrenica, that's why we're here today. They don't need answers for what should have happened. What they do need is the apportioning of blame. Somebody has to be held responsible for what happened, and somebody has to be made to pay what happened. Whether it's the individual soldiers, or whether it's government, that's what's important. That's how accountability works, that there has to be the apportioning of blame and there has to be responsibility taken. But more than that, I think one of the areas that Bosnia has really missed out on is having this truth-telling exercise. And that's something that we tried to focus on, certainly when I was there. But there was always a focus on it has to be justice first and reconciliation later, when they're not mutually exclusive. So I think that there is a lot that obviously should have been done, but there's still a lot that can be done now. And it's important for us not to forget. And that's why this discussion today, not with me, but the discussion that you're having with other people today is so important, because it makes people realize we haven't forgotten, and we really do need to learn from this.
Well, actually, I was coming to the point of asking you about the reconciliation, whether reconciliation is possible. Yes, of course, it is desirable after the conflicts, but under the circumstances, it seems that without justice being delivered, it will be hard to have a reconciliation on a large scale. So what should be done in order to serve justice, in order to bring people to justice? Because what we know is that only, I think, 90 people were sentenced to, for war crimes in the ICTY. Yesterday, we were talking about this with Dr. Nevenka Tromp. She studied this topic widely, and she has published on this point. And now there are a number of claims that only a very small number of people were held responsible. So what is your view on that? I mean, how justice could be delivered? What is the justice anyway? As you said, I mean, there is an expectation that some people, either individually or as an organization, should be held accountable for what has happened in Srebrenica.
I think that's an important question. I think what you when you ask the question, what does justice mean to you? What does justice mean to me? Depending who you ask, you'll get a different answer. So I think when you look at the numbers of individuals that have been held accountable, that have been put on trial and ultimately convicted, it is a very small number for what happened. In terms of reconciliation, I think reconciliation is absolutely essential. I've said justice has to play a very key part of that. You cannot have reconciliation without justice, of course. But I'll go back to a discussion that I had with one of the victims groups when I was there. This is probably about 2007, 2008. And I said, look, what about a truth-telling exercise? We need to think about the long term. The problem with that was that the message that was communicated to me was, yes, we will have reconciliation when all of them that committed crimes will have been prosecuted, convicted, and sent to jail. Then we can have a form of reconciliation. And unfortunately, I think that's one of the realities that you face. The other point that I would say is that the country is still deeply divided. Bosnia, the Dayton Peace Accord stopped the conflict, stopped the killing, but it didn't necessarily stop the war. You still have very, very divisive politics. You have a Serb member of the presidency who is opposed to the notion of a single Bosnian state, who, given any opportunity, would create almost like a Crimea out of Republic of Srpska to align it with either Serbia or Russia. So you have those challenges. The economy is in a dire state. There is very little prospect for the youth of Bosnia and Herzegovina. And so That is something that has to be taken into account because, as we know, economics are often at the central cause of any conflict. And I think that we look at Bosnia as a success of diplomacy and international law in practice. It was not. I mean, the carving up of Bosnia like a cheese board has not created a success. You have, for example, one of the biggest things that the international community focused on in the post-conflict was getting people to be able to return to their pre-war homes. And what you saw was people, for example, a Bosniak, a Bosnian Muslim, would return to Srebrenica to repossess their property. They would sell it and then move to Sarajevo or somewhere else where they felt that they would be more accepted and more protected than they would be in Serbian strongholds, which remained as divisive as they were before the war. So, and I think you have to take all of these factors into equation when talking about, is truth-telling possible? Is reconciliation possible? Frankly, it's not, because communities are so deeply divided still 25 years after the end of the war.
Toby, when we were talking about the UN Security Council system, you talked about the politicization of the UN Security Council, and the individual states, look after their own interests or interests of their own allies. So there's that reality on the one hand, but also there are this, international legal system or international courts. Do you feel that the international courts are also being politicized? Because when we look at the decisions, when we look at the discussions and debates, there is also that argument that politicization of the courts should be prevented, and how that could be done.
Well, yes, I think that there is a level of politicization of international courts and tribunals, whether we look at the ICTY, the Yugoslav tribunal, or we look at now the new permanent International Criminal Court, or the more recently created Kosovo Specialist Chambers in The Hague. I think they're all subject to a level of politicization and certainly a level of criticism. How do you remove that level of politicization? It's very, very difficult. I think the International Criminal Court, the idea behind it by separating it from the United Nations, was intended for it to be less of a politically motivated machine. The difficulty that you have is you then have the Assembly of State Parties that effectively individual states have the ability to influence the work of the court. But I think you also have one of the biggest problems with the international tribunals generally is that the personnel who are chosen to head the relevant institutions may bring their own personal or I don't want to say bias, because it's an unfair word to use, but I think that they will bring with them from their own country and from their own background a particular emphasis, shall we say. And I think with the International Criminal Court in particular, one of the criticisms that was made before the current chief prosecutor took over was the over-emphasis on Africa. And so there was a sense that there was an overemphasis on the cases that were brought having an African bias. The problem with that is that there were a large number of conflicts across Africa that needed to be dealt with. And you also have to think realistically, should the United Kingdom, should the United States, China, and other powerful states, Russia, be brought before the International Criminal Court? Yes, absolutely, they should. And there is a basis, almost certainly, for alleging crimes committed by those states over the past few years. But you also have to be realistic as to whether, I would say, whether the evidence can be presented that would be sufficient to take a case forward. But I think the biggest problem with the ICC now, as we're focusing on the now, as the first permanent court is that it has a very limited jurisdiction. So it has only those that are state parties or the UN Security Council.
Toby, we are coming to the end of our discussion. We are running out of time. My last question is the following. If the UN cannot prevent conflicts, if the UN cannot carry out its responsibility to protect civilians, who will do that? I mean, who should we invest our energy, time, and money so that the civilians could be protected? Or are we helpless?
Well, I think we probably faced the same question about 80 years ago, and which was behind the creation of the United Nations. So, I mean, I think you have to look at it in this way: that if the system does not work, then it has to be fixed. If it cannot be fixed, then it needs to be torn down and a new institution created. You have to ask, is it fit for purpose? Now, I'm not saying today that the United Nations should be torn down. Absolutely not. It should not be torn down. There are numerous problems with how it operates, and there are numerous restrictions on how it operates. But I don't think it is beyond repair. I think that it has to rethink its mandate. States that support it actually have to support it. You know, we have the United States now withdrawing funding from numerous UN agencies, which is deeply regrettable. But I think we need to refocus what the UN should be focusing on, and provide it with the tools, the finances, and the mandate to do it. Because frankly, that's why it's not achieving what we wanted to achieve.
Well, Toby Cadman, thank you very much for joining us today at the TRT World Forum. We thank you for your views and also your excellent recommendations how to fix the UN system. And we will be with you tomorrow again, talking about the 25th anniversary of the Srebrenica genocide. Thank you very much. Please join us tomorrow.
Thank you.